Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our professional liability webinar. This is going to be a webinar on the basics of professional liability. We will be doing an advanced version in the very near future, but this is a great place to get started with professional liability. I want to introduce myself, Anae Augustini. I'm CEO of CID Insurance Programs. Kevin Wills is going to be our instructor today. He's Second Vice President of USLI, United States Liability Insurance Company. We're really glad to have him on board to train for you today because he's a professional liability specialist. And then Dan Mulligan, of course, many of you will know, our senior professional liability underwriter. And last but not least is Kaylee Bolger, our marketing coordinator, who puts all of our webinars on and does a great job. So let's get started and talk about the objectives, and I'll turn it over to Kevin after that. So today, we want you to better understand errors and omissions coverage. So it's really crucial to understand the difference between general liability and professional liability coverage. So, and then learn who needs E&O coverage. That's how to be able to determine when you've got a professional or not. And then let's talk about the legal side of the E&O and what does an E&O look like. So, Kevin, I'll let you get started.
All right. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I can tell you that I've been doing this for quite some time, but prior to my professional liability life, I was a broker like most of you, and I can tell you that one of the most nerve-wracking situations was that last-minute submission that would come in, and it was always something that needed to be done right away because the job started tomorrow, and they needed general liability, and they needed professional liability, and general liability was easy. We did it all day. And it was simply going on to a carrier's rating system and rating it up and getting them a quote. But the professional was always something complex, and I never felt comfortable doing it. And now I look back at those days, and I wish I wasn't so naive because professional liability really isn't as complex as we all think it is. The great news is that not only is it something that you can get quotes on, and it's an industry where there's lots of opportunity. You have a great professional liability expert right in your backyard with Dan Mulligan, who I work with frequently, and he's a great resource for you for all these types of submissions. But what I thought I would do is try and explain at least the differences between general liability and errors and omissions. So general liability, where does it stop and where does E&O begin? So basic general liability, I think probably most of you know this, covers bodily injury and property damage as a result of an organization's operations. A lot of times it covers personal and advertising injury as it relates to marketing materials and things like that. And it can cover some products and completed operations if you're involved with developing products and the like. Most times, a GL policy, people think of GL for slip and fall, and that's really what the primary exposure for GL is. So these exposures are probably covered on most GL policies. Property damages to others as a result of the organization's activities. Personal injury, that's libel and slander as a result of the organization's communications, and that's important. It has to be through the organization's communications and not as a professional service, and we can talk about that a little bit later. The actual selling and providing of goods to the public, and of course, damages to premises rented. Here's where it gets a little bit dicey, where you don't know whether there's coverage or not. So abuse and molestation during an organization's activity, errors and omissions resulting from the organization's professional services, HNOA, or hired non-owned auto, things that are off-premise, maybe some special events, some host liquor. Those are things that may be covered on GL, may not. And a lot of them may not unless endorsed to do so. And here's the things that are definitely not. Automobile, watercraft, workers' comp, employer's liability, liquor liability, pollution, EPL, and that great data breach. So those are things that you'll see not covered on most GL policies. So here's what you need to be careful of. And this is where it gets a little bit complex, is you'll most often, unless you ask for it, you'll see abuse and molestation exclusions. So you want to be careful with what you're writing. If there is an abuse and molestation exposure, making sure that there is coverage there. Some people write premises only GL. So they don't want to cover things that happen in the field. They just want to cover things that happen in the office. So be careful there. Sometimes they'll put limitations on the things that are actually covered. So you need to be careful there. And this is the one we see the most, is almost all of them have professional services exclusions. So they're basically saying we are here to cover slips and falls. We are not here to cover any bodily injury that results from any professional service. It's a real key distinction and something that you need to make sure you're careful of. I mean, BOP forms have a standardized exclusion, and GL forms have an endorsement that excludes professional services. So that's GL. And here's E&O, and this is kind of where I do most of my work every day. You just want to kind of think about when you're talking general liability. Here's really the easiest distinction. It's bodily injury that occur on your premises. It's damage caused by your property, and again, it's that advertising injury caused by your marketing materials, your website, things like that. Professional is lawsuits that come from you being negligent within your professional services, or you fail to uphold contractual promises. You do something that's incomplete or shoddy, just not a good job, or you just simply make a mistake or errors. So we'll go through at the end of this a couple claims examples. We could spend hours on different claims examples. Some things you're just amazed on the errors that people make and how much a little error can cost. It's simply amazing. But professional liability is just the big exposure that is really important that you have coverage if they're providing a professional service. So what is a professional? That's the question. When do I need professional liability? It really comes down to a specialized talent. It's a livelihood. Do you use that talent to make a living? Most times it's more of an intellectual ability versus a physical skill. Here's the key: specialized training, education, continuing education, and licensed, certified, regulated by state and professional organizations. So someone who has to go to school or who needs continuing education. I mean, things that come to my mind would be an insurance agent, would be a doctor, would be a lawyer, would be an architect, an engineer, things along those lines where you need to be certified to be able to do your job. That's the ones that need professional liability. But there are other ones. I mean, you're talking consultants and travel agents and all types of occupations. They all need professional liability. So to be a professional, you need a special skill, knowledge, training, judgment, and expertise. Again, we talked about the examples: doctors, dentists, lawyers, architects, real estate agents, accountants, tons of claims within the accountants field, consultants. A key here is that a lot of times these services are provided for someone else, and usually it's for a fee. And you'll see language in professional policies that say for a fee. Here's really the key when it comes to professional liability policies. Most of them are coverage for negligence. Again, you make a mistake and there's a financial loss as a result of that mistake. But here's the key. 4 things, really. A professional duty has to exist. So really, it's a higher standard of care. If you're trained to be a doctor and your neighbor's not, should you have known that whatever you did would have caused an injury, would have caused financial loss? Or an accountant. Basically, your education makes you're held to a higher standard. So you're held to the higher standard of care. There's a breach of that duty to conform to the standards of that occupation. So I would expect you to know the new tax code if you're my accountant, because you should be trained in that field. I am not. So if we make a mistake on our tax return, that claim is going to come back onto the accountant. There has to be a connection between the conduct and the injury. Just because you make a mistake doesn't mean you can be sued. There has to be some financial loss as a result of that mistake, and then that damage has to be from that actual act or omission. Okay. Go back. Really, the key here on this slide is that professional liability is not, at least in most cases, does not cover bodily injury or property damage. It really is financial loss. If the client feels the financial loss could have been avoided, they will allege negligence on the part of the professional, and that is the bulk of all the suits that I see. That is it. Someone made a mistake, you caused me financial loss, and I'm suing you. It happens all the time.
Kevin, a
There are
question for you.
Yeah, absolutely, please.
Where does that? Is there an area where bodily injury or property damage can come into play?
There is.
Yeah,
there is, absolutely. There's something called contingent bodily injury and property damage that when you are in a position where there could be some bleed over, and instances would be, let's say, an architect or like a landscape architect, if they are involved with designing, someone's garden outside, and they put up a nice little pool area, they design trees, they put a bunch of things in the landscape, and something happens where one of the trees falls down into the house and then damages the house. Well, the GL carrier might say, you know what, we're not covering that because the damage to the house, or damage to the office in this case, we won't say house, was caused by the negligence of that architect. And the professional policy would say the same thing. The professional policy would say, hey, it's bodily injury, property damage. We have no coverage for that. We only cover financial loss. So contingent bodily injury is something that you want to look at for those type classes.
Optional coverage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's a question that popped up, and let me read it here. What about gyms with gym instructors? Does professional liability cover gym members using poor form under the direction of the instructor? So the professional liability wouldn't cover the actual gym member. Professional liability could cover let's say you have an independent physical fitness instructor, and they work for the gym down the street. What that instructor would be covered for if they had contingent bodily injury and property damage, which they probably would on an allied health type form. That's usually built into that form. They would have coverage if it's proven that the instruction given was negligent. That's the trick. So how do you determine what is poor form? That's really what needs to be proven in the court of law. So they'd have to be negligent in demonstrating a specific move or exercise, and then they'd have to prove that specific exercise was what caused the damage. So I hope that answers that question, but it definitely relates back to the professional services. So, this person being the fitness instructor should have is held to a higher standard of care because they're trained in that industry. So if they're the one teaching people poor form and injuries result, absolutely they can be sued, and those type policies could respond as long as they had that contingent bodily injury and property damage clause within that policy. Some other types of exposures outside of bodily injury are intellectual property, and this is a big one. I see this all the time. This is an emerging field within errors and omissions. Everything's done where you have digital marketing or search engine optimization or advertising agencies and media. All this stuff is just growing with leaps and bounds, and really the biggest coverage there is intellectual property. So let me give you an example of intellectual property. I'll date myself a little bit. And when I was younger, I was a wrestling fan back when it was called the WWF, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And as many of you know, when I say the words or the acronym WWF, it no longer stands for Worldwide Wrestling Federation. It stands for World Wildlife Fund. So you can imagine this was probably late 90s, early 2000s, when this really came to a head, where the World Wildlife Fund said, hey, you can't use WWF. We've been using this for years, and your organization does not represent what we believe in. I mean, they're two completely different entities. So this thing drug out for years. The guy who owns the Wrestling Federation, as you can imagine, was not one to easily settle. And eventually he wound up settling, but it took years and years of court costs to defend what really is intellectual property, who owned the rights to the WWF. was the Wrestling Federation hurting the brand of the World Wildlife Fund? That was really the suit. So that's a grand example, but think about it. Look on your desk. I'm looking at a Poland Spring water bottle. If anyone designs something that looks similar to that Poland Spring brand, Poland Spring can go out and sue. I know that Pepsi and Coke and all these people, they have people, their only job is to surf the web to see if people are using their brand without permission. So really that's a coverage that you want to look out for. We see claims for it all the time. E&O policies don't always cover them, so you need to make sure that if you are writing E&O and you do have that type of exposure, that you have this type of coverage within there. So that's, again, marketing people, graphic designers, maybe printers, advertising agencies, things like that. Another thing that sometimes is covered, but sometimes is not, is anything related to consumer protection law or like fair housing regulations. You want to make sure that, so say if they're involved with, telemarketing, you want to make sure that the policy doesn't have any exclusions for consumer protection law, because that's the type of suit that's going to come up. Say you're robo-dialing someone, could be a violation of the TCPA. I think it's the Telephone Protection Consumer Act. You want to make sure that your policy has coverage for that. And E&O policies they don't necessarily do unless endorsed. So just be careful there. But those are the three types of exposures you see for the most part, would be negligence, intellectual property, and violations of statutes. So who needs E&O? This is really why I think you guys are on the call, and really what keeps us in business, Dan and I in business, is all the people that need E&O. So let me go through a quick blurb here. So really what professional liability does is protects you against devastating effective lawsuits, regardless of whether an allegation has merit. So that's really a key. So you could be sued for basically anything, and you just want to make sure that there is coverage to at a minimum, defend you. And really, these types of lawsuits can incur substantial defense costs and could jeopardize a company's financial stability, especially if you're a small company. Professional liability is something that really backs you up and protects you in the case that there is an allegation. Even the best person, the most skilled, makes mistakes. So you want to make sure you have coverage for that. So who needs it? A lot of times this is contractually required, and that's the nice thing about E&O, is that people when they work job and they go job to job, they need E&O in order to get in the door. As I said, it's general liability. Sometimes it's work comp, and a lot of times it's E&O. E&O is usually the last piece of the puzzle, but it's something that they're not allowed to start working until they provide proof. Technology guys, that's what they need to walk in the door. Even if it's just to fix a printer, they need to show proof of professional liability. It's a growing field. Most of the jobs, the largest job growth is within the service sector, and people providing a service are the ones that need the E&O. We're looking at 30% growth in fields like statistical consultants or analytics. And anybody who watches any type of sport nowadays, it's all about analytics. Marketing consultant, research analysis, advertising, even interpreters and translators are all things that are growing upwards of 20, 25, 30%. Fundraising services. So it's definitely something where just knowing a little bit about E&O can differentiate you from your competitor. We all have backgrounds in general liability. There's only so many properties you can insure. There's only so much general liability out there, but professional liability is endless. Continue to see growth. Looking at these stats, 2000, this is an old slide, but 76% in 2004, and now it's up to 80% of all jobs are in the service sector. So that's going to continue to grow. Technology is a huge thing. And again, contractually related, which means they have to bind, which is what we all love to hear as underwriters, as brokers, is that not only do they have to get the quotes, but they have to bind because they can't start the job without it. There are many, many terms for professional liability. So you'll see these contracts and just know that there's really very little difference between the words malpractice, professional liability, E&O. You're going to see that in different variations within contracts. It's all the same. They're really looking for professional liability. and we've talked about the basics like lawyers and dentists and architects, but there are so many more, and I've kind of touched on some of them throughout the presentation so far. But here's technology, website design. I mean, anybody that's doing anything with technology has an E&O exposure. Big ones would be employment agency staffing firms. We've had claims, and we'll talk about one a little bit later, but you can really be sued if you make a mistake as an employment agency. Background checking services are all usually part of that same thing. Private investigators. This is the big ones here. The management consultants. Everybody seems to be a consultant nowadays, and they all need insurance. HR consultants giving out faulty advice on, what is Fair Labor Standards Act and what is compliance with all the different types of regulations that are out there. All that stuff is consulting, and every one of them has an exposure. People that are up on stage training people on whatever, they all have exposures for making mistakes within the content. Again, insurance agents, absolutely. I mean, the great example with insurance agents is the person who comes into your door. They say, give me full coverage. What the heck does full coverage mean? You need to know as an insurance agent that these are the exposures that are present for you. But you really need, if someone comes in and says, hey, give me full coverage, well, you need to run the gamut and run down your checklist to say, hey, these are the things I think you need. These are things you could have. You just need to make sure that you're giving them what they need. Claims adjusters and tax preparers and real estate agents, property managers, which I know is really close to Dan's heart. I mean, he does a ton of this stuff. So of all the classes we've talked about, I would say property managers, right, Dan? I mean, this is really where your expertise is unmatched. Not saying that you don't have expertise in the other ones, but I just know that property management is where it's at. Allied health is some of the questions that I've seen come through. Really in the allied health, the physical therapist, the physical fitness instructor, things like that is definitely a growing arena where people are willing to pay people to train them. And there's a need for insurance there. The marketing, we've kind of touched on the marketing piece, the graphic design, the event planner, those type things. I could run down thousands of classes, all of which that I've written or Dan has written, and I could probably give you claim examples on most of them. So there's definitely exposure out there, but I think I was going to limit it to a couple just for the sake of time here. But before that, I see some questions. Let me see if I can filter them through here. This is another question on.
I think it was tied to the last question, Kevin.
Oh, yes, I see. Let's say the gym member is lifting too much and tears a muscle while under the instruction of a gym member. Well, there wouldn't be any coverage because that's member to member. So there's really not professional liability coverage for members per se. The coverage is really for the instructor. So if the instructor was negligent in having someone lift too much weight, yes, there is potentially coverage there. But member to member, no. There wouldn't be professional liability coverage there. So I hope that helps answer that question.
And by the way, feel free to type in your questions into the chat room. So when we get to the end, we make sure that we answer all of your questions in a timely manner. Go ahead.
Definitely. So keep filtering them through, and I'll try and get to them throughout the conversation, or if not, we'll get to them after the fact. So I really have two claims examples here. The first one, tax repair. I mean, we just finished up tax season. This is an arena where we see a ton of claim activity and really a ton of activity from a submission perspective and a binder perspective. Every single person that does taxes needs insurance. So this is a real basic example. Let me read it through, or I'll try and paraphrase it so that I'm not reading to you all. But this is one where a suit alleged that a false tax return had been prepared on behalf of the original owner with knowledge that someone who was purchasing a business would rely on them. So what really happened here is, as you know, when you buy a business, you rely on the financials to see whether this is a viable business and something that's worth purchasing. The accounting firm made some changes a few years back to change really the revenue that was being provided. The revenue that was made by the initial owner. The new owners relied on that document and said, okay, this looks like it's making money. This is a good purchase. Turns out that they made these changes, but they couldn't document, or there was no documentation that really showed what forced them to amend the initial return. Initially, the return showed business income of $180,000, when in actuality it really was $5,000. So it looked like they were cooking the books. And if there was documentation on why they did that, then maybe there'd be a case to be made. Well, they didn't make a mistake. But without having documentation, it looks like they just manipulated the numbers. And sure enough, it wound up being a suit, and an insurance carrier wound up paying over $130,000 for defense and restitution. So something simple like that. And maybe it was really a mistake that they just initially put $5,000. It really was $180,000, but there's no proof of that. So when someone loses money, they're looking for someone to blame. And in this case, our accountant was the one that was to blame. So really basic example, but something that makes sense. Okay. This one really is interesting, and I could go through a bunch of these background checking ones, and I may mention another one after we talk this one. But a background screening firm was sued for attributing 6 criminal convictions to a plaintiff, resulting in lost wages and mental anguish. So it's a classic example where someone went to a background checking service. They said, "Hey, can you run a background check on my potential employee?" The employee comes up, and it looks like there was some issues being convicted of a crime, and it came back, so they denied him the job. And in turn, it looks like they actually searched the wrong person, so the background check was erroneous. The reason I bring this one up is that they didn't hire him. The demand was $100,000. The most the this is a car salesman, had ever made was $20,000, and the top salesman here earned $46,000, but yet the suit was for $100,000. It turns out that although the actual conviction that they reported was incorrect, there were a ton of actual convictions that they didn't find. They should have found. They didn't find on this guy's record, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was that they found one that really wasn't attributed to him, and in turn, they were sued. At the end of the day, it was a $60,000 settlement. So this person made more money than they ever would have made as a car salesman. And quite honestly, if they were honest on their application, they probably wouldn't have gotten hired. And if they ran the correct background check, they wouldn't have gotten hired. But since they made a mistake, they wound up making $60,000 out of the deal. So really crazy scenario. We had another one, and again, this is a background checking service. It just happened. That's why I almost find it comical, but it's not comical when you're paying. It's simply same situation. They run the background check. It comes back. Instead of being John W. Smith, it was John M. Smith. The same thing. They were going to be a professor at a college in Virginia. They came back with an allegation of sexual abuse and molestation. The college immediately said, "Sorry, we can't have someone like that around kids." It turned out that this guy had never done anything of the sort. They realized within, I think it was a day and a half or 2 days, that they made a mistake. It was the wrong person. The guy actually wound up getting hired at the university. No problem. Everything was good. But he still sued because of the mental anguish that was caused as a result of the professional mistake. And they wound up settling for $80,000. So he got the job. No harm, no foul, basically. But he claimed it, and they wound up getting money. So it's really amazing sometimes the suits that come out of professional liability out of a simple mistake. We just had another one where someone was involved in helping people fill out pre-filled wills and that type stuff. They had a bunch of these things, and these are all approved by lawyers, and they were just actually helping people fill them out. They didn't create the documents. They were just helping people fill them out. But it turned out that one of the people on staff at this organization happened to be a lawyer. Although he wasn't providing legal advice, there was a contested house within a will between brother and sister, and it turned out that the will was filled out incorrectly, and they blamed it on the advice of the poor person that was helping them fill out the form. They claimed, since there was a lawyer on staff, even though the lawyer wasn't part of the conversation, that they were being construed as providing legal advice, and the suit settled for almost $600,000. So it's just amazing, again, the type of suits that come out of professional liability. So it's really important that you feel free and you feel comfortable selling that. I went through that quickly. The next time we get together, it'll be a much more in-depth conversation about specific coverages related to professional liability. But really, the message here is it's not as complicated as it seems. And again, having just a little bit of knowledge in professional liability can really differentiate you from the guy down the street or the gal down the street, because being able to round out your account is so important, because if you don't do it, someone else is going to, and you're going to lose the entire thing.
Well said, Kevin. And thank you so much for, there is one question. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in now, and I'll keep talking. We've got one that Kevin can answer now.
Yeah, let me go do that one. What about an architect that goes on to job sites? Is the answer that their GL and E&O should be with the same carrier? That's a great question, and it's something that we recommend highly. So it's really good to have E&O and GL together because of that gray area that exists between the GL carrier who really doesn't want to cover bodily injury and property damage that results from professional services, because they have that exclusion in the form, and the professional policy who clearly excludes bodily injury and property damage. When you have them both together, it eliminates the gray area. You're not pointing to which carrier is going to pay for the claim. It's the same carrier. And a lot of times when a carrier is willing to put together PLGL, then there's really an extension for coverage for bodily injury. So that's a great question, but yes, definitely. If you can put them together, I would always recommend it. Plus, usually it makes it simpler, especially on the smaller ones, that one bill, one policy, it just makes it a whole lot easier for everybody involved. Great question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and good answer.
So
I don't see any other questions at this point. If you are typing in right now, I'll finish up, and then we can we'll answer any more questions as at the end.
Hey, here's another one. Here's a good question. I'm glad you called me on it. So I said I had a claims example for a staffing agency. I currently insure a staffing agency. I'm curious to see what the claim example would be. I actually have two. One was an example of a temporary employment agency, which was written on a PLGL form, and they were placing people doing landscaping, and they were doing landscaping at a prison. Not landscaping as well as mowing lawns, things like that. They were mowing lawns and damaged property as I think rocks flew up. Just a simple GL claim. But what happens is that when you cover staffing agencies, you really want to see whether the services of the placed employee are covered on the form. And in this case, they were providing landscaping, and the form covered services of the placed employee, and there was coverage. So that's a basic, more of a GL question or GL type claim, and it's one where it really wasn't worth arguing who was going to pay because the carrier was the same, being us in this case. The other one, this one's even more interesting, and it really kind of gets into cyber, which I don't want to touch. That's a whole nother conversation, but it gets into a staffing agency that placed a city manager. So they were responsible for managing funds for a particular little town. So they were in control of the budget, and they had access to financial funds. They were tricked into sending $127,000 to a specific vendor. So a lot of times people would call that maybe social engineering. And there are separate coverages for first-party social engineering on a cyber form, but I don't want to confuse you in that space. But where there was coverage in this case is it goes back again to whether or not the staffing agency has coverage for services of the placed employee. In this case, they did. So this person was negligent in his professional services as a manager, releasing funds to a vendor. They didn't double check, do a double verification there, and the E&O carrier wound up paying the $137,000. So that's that claim. I mean, you have other claims where you didn't vet out the person properly. So say you were placing an engineer and you went through his background, said they had a degree at a certain spot, and it turns out they didn't have it, or they didn't have the years of experience that they said that they had. Your job as the employment agency really is to make sure that the candidates that you send over are qualified and are who they said they are. So that's really the claims scenario that you see. But the great thing about staffing agencies is not only as an agent, and it's something that I would recommend if you're looking for classes of business to target. I guess all of you can't target everybody on here. Targeted that, then it'd be a very competitive space. But the good news about a staffing agency is that when you cover the staffing agency, a lot of times you can also cover the individuals that are placed. So if you say it's an IT staffing agency, if you cover the whole thing, eventually they're on their own, and now they're working either as independent contractors or usually as independent contractors for a company. You can now provide their individual E&O as well. So it's a nice niche to get into in the E&O world. Great question. Thanks.
That's really good. Okay. If another one comes in, Kevin, you can chime in. Otherwise, I want to just remind everyone that we've got upcoming webinars. You can visit our website, CID Insurance, for the webinars that are upcoming, and that's under resources menu tab at the top under webinars. And as well, this has been recorded, so you could go and watch any of our webinars. There's probably 6 to 8 of them that are there already, and you're going to see it just as you've seen it today. So if you want to, just get a refresher of the things that Kevin was talking about, that's a great place to go. It's a great tool to use. Also, you'll be receiving a survey, and we really appreciate your feedback. We want to be able to do the best job that we can for you, so any positive or improvement feedback is welcomed. Also, some of these products can be web and phone quoted. USLI offers a great service. We prefer the phone quotes, but for 5 minutes without an application, you can get a quick quote on miscellaneous E&O, employment practices liability, and cyber, and technology E&O. So that's a great place. Dan does a fantastic job of doing phone quotes on a lot of the risk as well. So without an application and a little bit of information, he can get you a phone quote that's bindable very quickly. Same day, maybe within an hour, knowing Dan. And then again, please submit your submissions at CID Insurance Programs, and reach out to Dan Mulligan if you have any questions, because he'll certainly be there to take care of you. If there are no other questions, then I thank you all for attending. Wish you a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.